Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vitor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben, it has been an awful week.
What a week we've had. Yeah.
Our president is a horrible racist. We're going to talk about how those comments are being received globally, in one case maybe echoed by a foreign official. We're going to talk about the new asylum rules, an Iran update. Vice President Biden gave a big foreign policy speech. Angela Merkel, a quick North Korea update, and then the bigoted conspiracy theory nut being floated to run the nation's intelligence community. No, not Donald Trump, a guy named Fred Fleitz. So it really comes full circle at the end there, Ben. And then I speak with Army veteran and U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth about a whole host of interesting stuff. So do not skip that part. It is a great episode. Ben, you want to start with these new asylum rules?
Yeah.
So, okay. They announced these new asylum rules this week. It will functionally prevent any Central American from seeking asylum in the U.S. The new rule says that people from Honduras or El Salvador would have to apply for and be denied asylum in Guatemala or Mexico before you can apply in the U.S. We're putting a step between the asylum process step. Guatemalans would have to apply for and be denied asylum in Mexico before they can apply in the U.S. So this will, it will pick up and change the asylum rules for people from other countries, but the vast majority of asylum seekers are coming from these northern triangle countries, so it's really going to harm them. Apparently, Guatemala and Mexico are just not on board with this plan at all. We should also be clear that these countries have zero infrastructure to house or feed or otherwise deal with these asylum seekers. So to sum it up a bit, the U.S. is basically eliminating asylum for the Central Americans who are trying to seek it most often. We're angering the leaders of neighboring countries and potentially destabilizing them by trying to force countries with no infrastructure to take a flood of migrants. What did I miss?
Well, a few things I'd add to that. One, this is likely to face legal challenges because
important point.
There's a sense that this violates both existing U.S. and international laws around asylum, which establish a pretty clear procedure for someone to be able to come to the United States and declare their intent to pursue asylum, and then the judge hears those cases. The second thing is, once again, this shows that Trump isn't really trying to solve the actual problem, right? So the reason why, let's be clear. People don't leave their homes and risk the lives of their children unless they face significant harm. And I have a daughter. She's here today, actually.
She's very quietly
quietly watching an
calmly
iPad.
hanging out, watching a movie. It's very impressive.
Hopefully this holds. But to be clear, take the man who drowned in the river. If you're going to swim across the river with your child, it's not just because you want a job. Yeah. It's because whatever's happening back home is so terrible that you have no other recourse. You believe you have no other recourse. And what we've seen is the proliferation of violence in these Central American countries, the breakdown of governance has led to this crisis of children coming to our borders, of families coming to our borders. Let's be clear, this isn't like the migration we saw 10, 20 years ago, where it was mainly men coming to try to work in the United States. These are families fleeing an intolerable situation. If Trump really wanted to deal with that, he would be trying to provide assistance to those Central American countries to deal with their security challenges, to deal with their governance challenges. And we've done that in the past in neighboring Colombia down in South America, where we dramatically improved the situation over a period of years because of our assistance. Instead, he's tried to both zero out the assistance to these countries while also putting in place these asylum rules. It shows he's not trying to actually solve the problem of what is driving people to our borders. He's just trying to demagogue the issue. It also speaks to basically the cruelty of denying these people any opportunity to petition to get into the United States. And we should also be clear, Tommy, like in the past, some of the populations who've come to the United States because they've been fleeing violence or risk of persecution have become very successful immigrant communities in the United States. The Vietnamese, who we resettled here in enormous numbers at the conclusion of the Vietnam War, are now a thriving immigrant community. So we benefit as Americans, too, from providing a safe haven to people. That's been a part of who we are, a part of our immigration and foreign policy for decades, if not centuries. And to just try to upend that to score some cruel political point against brown people as part of your political strategy it really speaks to the depravity that we've sunk to here in the Trump years.
Truly, and to be so cowardly and just to hide behind bureaucracy, to make a whole bunch of new bureaucratic hurdles for people, and be like, "Oh, we fixed the glitch, Milton. You'll no longer get a paycheck." It's like Office Space, if anyone's old enough to watch that. I mean, it's like it is so cynical and so cruel and so far from addressing the actual challenge we face that I don't know what to. And the near-term next phase of this migration crisis is Venezuela collapsing.
Yeah.
The a little less near-term, but not that far-off-term version is when climate change just radically changes your ability to feed yourself in all of these countries. So
it's a great point. And let's be clear, he's making all these situations worse.
Right.
He's making the situation in Central America worse by cutting off the assistance. He's making the situation in Venezuela worse through the really aggressive use of sanctions. So he's driving more people to the United States. Yeah. And if you're really cynical, maybe that's what he wants. Maybe he doesn't actually want to solve the crisis at the border. Maybe he sees it as a convenient part of his politics heading into 2020, which is really kind of grotesque to consider.
Yes. Speaking of politics in 2020, let's talk about Iran for a bit. On Sunday, Iran's president gave a speech where he said that Iran is willing to talk with the U.S. if we lift sanctions and get back into the Iran deal. So we have a pathway to get back to square one, I guess.
Yeah.
Great. On a previous show, we had both talked about how stupid it was and self-defeating it was for the administration to sanction Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif. Well, the administration apparently now has backtracked. First, they gave him a visa that said he could attend meetings at the UN, and then they fully backtracked and said they won't actually sanction him at all. So that's good. Pompeo has already spoken out about Iran's overture and said he's skeptical of the potential talks. The Europeans are just pissed off and frustrated with everyone. They're scrambling to save the Iran deal by saying on the record that the breaches that they have made so far in terms of their enrichment activity are not a big deal and can be reversed. That is accurate, but Bibi Netanyahu compared that response to appeasement of Nazis in the 30s.
Yeah, his standard play.
He's being helpful as always. So, I mean, look, I guess it's better than shooting down drones and the war of words that followed, but time is running out to save this deal.
Yeah, and I mean, what it feels like is happening is Trump got to the brink of launching Bolton's war, and he blinked, as we saw. The Iranians, by the way, saw him blink, right? Mm-hmm. So now they know, okay, maybe this guy's not going to pull the trigger. And everybody's looking for a way out. And there was a way out, the Iran deal. It feels like now they might be prepared to entertain some kind of modest relief of the sanctions that they've reimposed in exchange for Iran potentially reversing this enrichment step.
Yeah.
What's amazing about this is it feels like what they might be headed towards if they actually sit down and talk to the Iranians is something far less than the Iran deal, right?
I know.
So basically an incremental step by the Iranians in response to an incremental step from us without the kind of full and comprehensive infrastructure of the Iran deal in place. It speaks to kind of the insanity of their policy. And once again, the common thread here, it just feels like they want the domestic politics of looking like, oh, I got out of, we had the news of the British ambassador's cable leaking saying that they pulled out of the Iran deal because they wanted to spite Obama, as if we needed a leaked cable from the British ambassador to know that, right? So they're just kind of looking for some way to climb down here. The Europeans are frustrated because the way to climb down is the deal that was in place and that was working. And they'll probably settle for some half measure that they'll celebrate as some vindication of their policy when, in fact, it's not even as comprehensive as what was already in place.
They are just creating all the wrong incentive structures, right? I mean, the Iranians are watching North Korea, seeing them be bad actors, and realizing that creates leverage for you to get concessions. By the way, Sunday, July 14th, was the 4-year anniversary of the Iran deal, so pour one out for the echo chamber.
Yeah, I remember. I remember that day very well. Hadn't slept in days, and felt like we'd solved this problem. And actually, the funny thing about this, Tommy, is it should be pointed out that most of what Iran had to do for the Iran deal, they had to do at the beginning. Mm-hmm. So, destroying the core of their heavy water reactor, right. Pulling out centrifuges, shipping out stockpile. So, like a lot of things, the situation improved dramatically. Iran's nuclear program, even with this enrichment step, as Europeans pointed out, is still far behind where it was on July 14th, 2015. So it gives them this space to operate in without Iran being at the brink of having a nuclear weapon. So pour one out for the Iran deal.
Yeah. Thanks, Obama.
But yeah, thanks, Obama. And here we are again, Javad Zarif, the same guy who negotiated the Iran deal with us. And now they're signaling that they want to talk to the guy. You've got people who've been opponents of the Iran deal suggesting that the fact that Iran wants to talk to them is a vindication of their policy, when in fact it shows that they recognize that quote unquote maximum pressure is not making Iran capitulate. So here we are. But it does show. Clearly, Pompeo has the signal from Trump, I don't want to have a war.
Yeah, right.
And that's good. I mean, I don't want to say credit because we shouldn't be in this place in the first place. But at least we're not where we are, as you said, when it looked like we were going to go to war over some drone.
Yeah. And so I just want to note that just because we think Trump's Iran policy is stupid doesn't mean we think the Iranian government is filled with good guys. And here's an example of why. Many of you listened to the episode we did with friend of the pod and former Washington Post Tehran bureau chief Jason Rezaian. He was held hostage by the Iranians for 544 days for no reason, none whatsoever. Everyone should read his book, Prisoner, which documents the entire saga. It's fascinating. But apparently Iranian state TV is now airing a TV show called Gondo that attempts some revisionist history about Jason's detention. It portrays a fictionalized version of him as some sort of American super spy sent to Iran to take down the government, which, if you know Jason, is very funny.
Yeah.
I have not watched this series, but the AP report on it says the show makes the Iranian foreign ministry look inept and thus, by extension, makes President Rouhani look inept because his team negotiated the deal. So it seems like this could be propaganda from the IRGC or the intelligence services against Jason, against more moderates in the government. But, regardless, from imprisoning Jason to pouring money into the show to all the bad things in between, like these guys consistently make the dumbest strategic choices possible.
Well, yeah, and I don't want to put words in Jason's mouth, but I talked to him a lot about this, and I think he would agree with the fact that it also shows that there are these competing power structures in the Iranian government, as you alluded to. So essentially the hardliners, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, they never liked the Iran deal. They never liked any form of deeper engagement with the West. They saw what the foreign ministry was doing in negotiating the Iran deal as a threat. They saw Jason as a reporter who was seeking to kind of build bridges and demonstrate a different face of Iran to the rest of the world as a threat. And this is a twofer for them because they get to, get back onto their kind of fake hobby horse. Jason was somehow a spy trying to undermine the Iranian government. They get to make their foreign ministry look feckless. I should add that doesn't absolve the foreign ministry either. Jason would be the first to say the foreign ministry was kind of weak in not standing up to this kind of behavior and essentially implicitly going along with it. So yes, this speaks to the ugly side, one of the several ugly sides of the Iranian regime, their kind of hackish propaganda. Frankly, I think most Iranians are somewhat able to sort this out and recognize what is propaganda and what is not. But at the same time, all that Trump has done is, empowered those people because essentially they've said, see, it was wrong to try to think that we could engage the West. The right course to take is a hard line here, and that's where we appear to be stuck.
Yeah. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the global reaction to Trump's racist tweets and comments, including one very misguided official from China who seemingly decided to echo him. So our president is a gigantic, awful racist. Let's talk about him for a minute. I think a thing that's important for us to remember when these things happen is that U.S. political news is essentially global news by default, right? I mean, it's watched around the world. So when our dotty-old racist tweets something racist and stupid about 4 members of Congress, foreign leaders get asked about it. In the UK, Jeremy Hunt and Boris Johnson took the spineless GOP approach by condemning the tone of Trump's comments, but really refusing to call them racist. Now, Boris said some pretty racist things about Obama back in the day, so I don't particularly care about his take, but it was notable. Theresa May called Trump's comments completely unacceptable. In Canada, Justin Trudeau also didn't use the word racist, which is annoying, but he did say a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, and the diversity of our country is, in fact, one of our greatest strengths. So I think that's a pretty obvious rebuke. So, I mean, I think it's interesting that globally, people think that Trump's comments are awful, but most are still afraid to say exactly why because they don't want to risk his ire. But look, as always, like this guy is teaching a global awful example about the power. Let me say that again. But as always, I mean, Trump's comments are global news. They're setting an example for kids in every country around the world, and it's creating political challenges for leaders in every country around the world.
It's creating political challenges for those leaders, but more than that, it's basically giving away any semblance of our moral authority, right? And any semblance of our democratic example around the world. Just to give you a few examples, I was just recently in Africa, and I talked to a bunch of African kind of leaders in civil society and entrepreneurs. And they made the point, first of all, this comes after the whole shithole country thing, right? Yeah. So if you're an African, you've been called a shithole country, and now you see him essentially making racist comments about people of color. And what some of these people said to me is, look, the Chinese are coming in here to Africa, and they're spending money, and they're trying to move in here and become the key player in Africa and not the United States. And the advantage the United States used to have is we seem to stand for something different from what China did. China just stood for spending money and trying to buy influence. The U.S. used to stand for some democratic values and human rights. And even if we weren't perfect in our pursuit of those, at least we had the example of a place where you could make it no matter what you look like, right? And Trump has just given that away. And suddenly we're no different from China. We're just another big country that tries to throw our weight around. And if anything, we're worse. We've got an outwardly racist president who seems to not even care about Africa and call it shithole countries, right? Undermines our influence there. Will have long-term repercussions for us there. Businesses will look to China. Foreign students will look to China. That's already happening, right? When we seek to, if we tried to hold China to account for putting 1 million people in concentration camps, for instance, you can bet that they'll be throwing back in our face the fact that we've got people, and I don't want to say it's a direct analogy because it's far more widespread in China, but they're going to point to those camps at the border, and they're going to point to Trump's racist comments and say, who are you to lecture us on anything, right? Yeah. And so countries like China who abuse human rights will throw all this stuff back in our face and say, we're not going to listen to you guys. And so the lack of the United States being able to be associated with certain values, and instead the United States being associated with people living in depravity in camps at the border and a racist president, that has both strategic repercussions, right? Because it's alienating huge chunks of the world that are important to us, and it's going to dramatically undercut any moral authority that we have left to try to advocate for these values. So, here I know it looks like just another outrage, and you got people talking about whether this is politically smart of him. The kind of outrageous shift from, instead of focusing on the racism, focusing on the potential political wisdom of the racism.
It kills me.
And yet we're losing the thing that made America distinct, like for the last 70 years at least, if not more, right? The thing that separated us from other countries, we were supposed to stand for something. And we're giving all that away. And I think we have to recognize, too, it's not necessarily going to come back even if we win the election right away, because people are looking at America and thinking, like, what had happened here? How did these people elect this person, right? And why does he continue? Everywhere I go around the world, people say, well, why does he continue to have so much support there, right? Why aren't you standing up to him more? And so to me, it just points to the stakes in this next election that he has to be beaten, and there has to be a rebuke of this behavior if this behavior is validated. Yeah. If the rest of the world sees Trump being a racist, Trump putting people in camps, and then sees him reelected, they will probably permanently change their view of what the United States is.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the China example, because it does seem that the Chinese have noticed that toxic racism and Twitter get paired a lot in the U.S. these days. I mean, so China's deputy chief of mission in Pakistan decided to tweet about this pathetic, ridiculous letter that got signed by 34 countries, including Saudi Arabia and Egypt, that defended China's treatment of Muslims. Apparently, they missed the news of the millions of Muslims being tortured in these re-education camps. So this official, Li Zhanzhu, tried to say that the letter was somehow a slap in the face of the U.S. and added, quote, "If you're in Washington, D.C., you know the white never go to the SW, Southwest area, because it's an area for the black and Latin. There's a saying, black in and white out, which means that as long as black family enters, white people will quit and price of the apartment will fall sharply." Wow. That led our former colleague, Susan Rice, to call him on Twitter a, quote, "racist disgrace and shockingly ignorant." Susan does not mince words. Zhu ended up deleting the tweet, but Ben, I have to think that these officials are feeling emboldened by Trump's tone. And as you said, like, happy to throw these issues and racism in the United States back in our face.
I mean, first of all, that never would have happened 3 years ago,
No.
right? Part of what's so infuriating about this guy knows in any normal administration, even if you were attacking the past administration of a different party with that kind of language, the current administration would call you up and be like, what the fuck are you doing?
what are you
know?
doing? Yeah.
Instead, this guy's like, oh, maybe this is a way to endear myself to the Trump people, right? Bashing, because he bashed back at Susan Rice and called her a disgrace. It was like this kind of weird tit for tat. No, you're the disgrace. So the fact that they feel this impunity to like level these racist, grotesque charges about Washington. First of all, pretty fucking dumb way of talking about Washington, D.C., right? Because first of all...
Totally wrong.
Yeah, well, first of all, this guy was in D.C. 10 years ago. There was a black family that moved in the White House. I didn't see any of the rent values. Actually, the rent went up.
Rent went
right?
way up.
We had a black family right in the heart of D.C., and rent went up everywhere in D.C., if I remember it. Southwest D.C. is like one of the booming parts of the city. So put all that aside, the fact that he's just wrong. But the fact that this is the discourse now, and that countries feel like that their diplomats can engage in this kind of behavior on Twitter and get into weird racist Twitter fights with people, is just an absurd way of dealing with things.
He's gunning for a Fox News contributor post. Let's do a little 2020 news because that's more hopeful. So last week, Vice President Biden gave a lengthy foreign policy speech. I thought the New Yorker summarized it well as lighter on details, heavier on framing, which is not a criticism, but it's sometimes the only way to make a global foreign policy speech clock in under an hour, right? You got to make some choices. A lot of the speech was a call for us to get our own democracy and values in order. A quote that got picked up a lot was foreign policy is domestic policy and domestic policy is foreign policy. He called out Trump for coddling dictators, for hemorrhaging alliances. One of the big new ideas he talked about was a global summit for democracy in the first year, which is an interesting idea. It sounds like he wants to reboot TPP and use that kind of a tool to deal with China on trade, but he didn't explicitly say so. Interestingly, Biden is not calling for the U.S. to bring all troops home from Afghanistan. He wants to leave a residual presence of some sort to focus on al-Qaeda and ISIS. As you remember well, Biden was deeply skeptical of sending additional troops to Afghanistan as far back as 2009. So it was notable. I mean, it's probably what passes for being courageous or having the courage of your convictions to say something that will be unpopular in a primary, whether or not we agree with that. Mostly we don't. He also said we should end support. He also said we should end support for the war in Yemen. Ben, so this seemed like a return to a more traditional foreign policy, to the Obama foreign policy. Not a ton of huge changes or ideas, but did anything jump out at you that I missed here?
I do. I think this democracy piece ties directly back to what I was saying, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, because people have said this for a long time, foreign policy is domestic policy, blah, blah. That is actually much more true today.
Yeah.
And he had a long section at the beginning where he said, essentially, if we want to once again be the leader in the world and we want to promote democracy, voting rights at home is a part of that, right? Getting our democracy in order is a part of that. How we treat people coming here is a part of that. That is very true. Those are not just platitudes. It essentially, we are going to have a president who comes in and recognizes in a very deliberate way that they need to show the world we are restoring the power of our moral example. Because again, if we're not, then we're no different than Russia and China. We're just some other big country trying to throw our weight around. So I really like that Biden drew this direct connection between investing in democracy at home, and then said, I'm going to take that show on the road, and we're going to have this global summit on democracy, which, again, might have seemed like kind of a hokey thing to do in the past. That is badly needed right now. It's badly needed for us to plant a flag in the ground and say, there's an authoritarian trend around the world. You see it emanating from China. We've talked about all the creeps in Europe. And I think the U.S. taking it upon itself to say, we recognize we went down a pretty dark path. We're fixing that here, and we want to talk to you guys about how to fix this around the world, was a smart thing to do. I think beyond that, I was a little surprised because, Biden was the Afghan skeptic there. Mm-hmm. But, and I don't agree. I we've talked about this. I think, 20 years after the fact, it's time to get everybody out of Afghanistan. But, I mean, if you're talking about just a residual counterterrorism force, that's at least different than saying, we need to stay to convince the Taliban we're never going to leave and all the rest of it. So it is a more scaled, it's a more scaled back mission. And on TPP, I do give him the courage of his convictions. Like, if you want to get smart on China, that is the way to do it. If you want to have trade that can be embedded with progressive values, you can build from TPP, which dealt with labor rights, it dealt with environmental protections. So, I think it was a lot of return to Obama, but it was appropriately updated for the things that have happened in the ensuing
Yeah.
3 years. And that's why I think it was an effective approach.
Yeah, I should say, I don't know that I heard him say TPP. He just sounded like creating a regional approach to dealing with the Chinese on trade. I just don't want to get a missive from Tony Blinken, who's, it would actually probably be like the most polite, angry missive ever. But
Tony would be incredibly polite.
It'd be like a handwritten letter thanking you.
Yes, and has incredibly wonderful, warm man with very good hair. But yeah, if you're talking about a regional approach,
right.
The TPP exists already. I mean, we bear in mind, like a lot of things Obama did, it's still just like Paris continues without us, Iran deal in some ways continues without us. The rest of the countries in TPP are in TPP, and they're waiting for us. They're like, hey, if you want to come together with us to stand up to the Chinese and to open markets and trade, it's available to you. So I think it was likely a nod in that direction, but they may have not wanted to plant that flag and pick that fight in the primary.
Became a thing in the last primary between Bernie and Hillary Clinton. I mean, it's interesting to me that Biden clearly sees his experience as a strength in the foreign policy arena. It will be worth watching whether, Bernie Sanders and others rejoined her that, well, you voted for the war in Iraq. How should we trust your judgment now? Whether that sticks or the more recent 8 years of Biden's work under Obama sticks. But, I think I want to see everybody make a speech like this. I want to hear your worldview, and they should do it sooner than later.
Yeah, we've had Buttigieg, we've had Warren, we've had Sanders. I would really like to hear from Kamala Harris.
Me too.
She's been on the Foreign Relations Committee. This is an area where, she's obviously been impressive of late on the campaign. So this is something where she could stake out a claim and show that she's, ready to lead on the world stage like this. With Biden, it's interesting. I mean, as someone who, along with you, really helped make the argument against all the candidates who voted for the Iraq War, I think that's totally valid. I will say, having sat in the Situation Room, Joe Biden was as skeptical of military intervention as anybody in our administration. He was against the war in Libya. He was against the troop surge in Afghanistan, and he was kind of an outlier in that respect, right? So I actually do believe that Biden is instinctively less inclined to go to military intervention than people might think. And
that's a really good point.
And that may be because he's been around for a long time and he's seen these military interventions gone bad. I would actually say in general with Biden, talking about his evolution. I mean, we've obviously seen this on issues involving race and crime. Mm-hmm. Same thing here. I mean, it's fair to say he's evolved and he learned from that vote. And what he learned from that vote and the ensuing war is, to be skeptical of the value of these interventions.
Yeah, good point. This is a weird story. So turning to Germany for a minute, German Chancellor Angela Merkel has been seen, I don't know how to describe it, uncontrollably shaking at, I think, 3 public events now. Obviously, we are not doctors. We are not trying to diagnose her, but it makes me worried, understandably. And I was hoping you could talk about your experience working with Angela Merkel. I know you spent a lot of time with her personally, what you think her leadership means to Germany and the world right now, and what kind of leadership might come next.
Well, look, I have great affection for Angela Merkel. And look, part of this, I don't know, I'm not a doctor. She's been Chancellor of Germany for almost 15 years, right? Mm-hmm. So the level of fatigue.
Oh my God,
and I write about this in my book. When we went to see her after the election, she was kind of stricken, right? Because she knew what was coming with Trump. And she indicated to Obama that she would have likely retired, not sought another term as chancellor. She was ready to kind of pass the torch, but the combination of Brexit and then Trump getting elected made her think that she almost had an obligation to stick it out. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of what Merkel's done in her tenure is try to hold together Europe, not just Germany, but Europe, and kind of the liberal order in the world, helping to navigate through the financial crisis and the Greek debt crisis in Europe, taking in 1 million refugees to set an example that Europe can't turn its back on people, and frankly to make amends for some of Germany's history, obviously, in doing so. Standing up to Russia and being a leader with us in imposing sanctions over their annexation of Crimea. A lot of her leadership has been anchored in how do I hold the European Union together through these very tough times. I think and it remains an if Europe is able to weather these storms, people will look back at this period of time and think Angela Merkel was like the rock at the center of Europe at one of the most difficult times after World War II. And her legacy will be she is responsible in many ways for holding together the European project. Yeah. Never mind the fact that Germany's been very successful under her tenure. if she's gone, what we're seeing in Germany is very interesting, and we should probably do a deeper dive at this at some point in the pod, but German politics is very fluid right now.
Yeah.
There's been this talk of the rise of the far right, but there's also been a dramatic rise from the Green Party, has actually passed the Social Democrats. So you have this fracturing of the political parties there. I think if she's removed, Germans have, not just an election, but it's going to take them some time to sort it out in terms of where the balance of power is in that country. What does that mean? That means that France is the balance of power in Europe probably shifts from Germany, which has been at the center of things for most of the last decade, to Macron and France kind of being more in the driver's seat in Europe, particularly with the Brits leaving, obviously.
You think Macron can stick around that long?
Well, we'll see what happens in the election, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think he's in a slightly stronger position than people might think, just because there's no obvious alternative to him, right? Because there's Le Pen on the far right, and so Merkel leaving, which she said she's going to do anyway at some point,
Right, like 2021.
Yeah, I think that will lead to a lot of instability in German politics. Her successor is not that popular. A lot of jockey among these parties, some strange coalition governments. I think Germany will be fine. I don't think it's going to go the way of the far right. That's still a relatively small portion of the politics there. But that means that Germany's no longer, again, this dominant player in Europe. And, the power shifts a bit probably to the French. And, we'll see what other leaders emerge in Europe.
Yeah, well, here's the hoping that Angela Merkel is A-okay.
I hope she's okay, though. Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's just really hot. There's a lot of these events are like outdoors, standing for hours with some other head of state for some ceremonial thing. But
it's when it happens a few times that you wonder if there's anything wrong with her. I think we do owe her. There very few politicians, Tommy, when we were there in other countries, were able to take politically unpopular stands because they thought it was right. And she did it on all those three things, on keeping Greece in the Eurozone, even though it cost German taxpayers, taking in all these refugees, standing up to Russia. She showed real principled leadership.
Yeah, she really did. We stand Angela Merkel here. A quick North Korea update. So literally no one will be shocked to learn that Trump's meeting at the DMZ with Kim Jong-un yielded no results. Today, the AP reports that North Korea suggested they may call off their suspension of nuclear and missile tests because of upcoming military drills between the U.S. and the South Koreans. As we've talked about before, North Korea has always hated these drills, and now Trump has to decide if he's going to suspend them again, which would be giving a big chit to Kim Jong-un. But as we talked about with our friend Danny Russell, who's a Korea expert, these drills, this training, it's really important. And we would probably get to a place where no one in the Korean military or, in the U.S. service members who are deployed to the region had really been trained in what to do if there was a North Korean invasion. So, more great progress.
Well, and let's keep in mind, right? Since Trump had the first summit in Singapore, what have we seen? We've seen all this praise from him. We've seen this quote-unquote historic handshake at the DMZ. Meanwhile, they've built more nuclear weapons. They've tested some weapons. They're threatening to test some more weapons. They've extracted concessions with us on military exercises. That doesn't show a lot of respect for Trump.
No.
Trump has lavished respect on Kim Jong-un. Look at Kim Jong-un's action. First of all, Kim Jong-un never reciprocates. Have we seen Trump always says he actually has beautiful letters. We've never seen the letters. We've never heard Kim say these things about Trump. And meanwhile, his actions seem to show no respect for Trump, right? If you look at the Iranians increasing their enrichment, Kim Jong-un making these threats and continuing to build nuclear weapons, this isn't working. This whole madman diplomacy, unpredictable, America first guy. So it's very important to remind ourselves that, check the results here. The way these leaders act shows how much respect they have for Trump.
Yeah. Interestingly, I noticed over the weekend, I think, our former colleague, former deputy CIA director and acting CIA director, Michael Morrell, wrote an op-ed about how a freeze-for-freeze proposal with North Korea, basically where we would give them some sanctions relief for them to freeze their program where they are now, is a good path forward. Michael Morrell is no softie when it comes to North Korea or the reality of threats generally. So I thought it was interesting to see him write that piece.
I think it is a good path forward. I just wish that we had started there in Singapore. So what's interesting is, unlike Iran, where we started this conversation, they're winding their way around back to this fairly incremental deal when they came out saying that they were going to achieve denuclearization and get rid of these nuclear weapons. And 3 years later, lo and behold, now they're trying to settle for half a loaf, which is where you begin negotiations, not where you end them.
Yeah, they are not good at this. Okay, last topic. Jonathan Swan from Axios reported that President Trump is considering replacing Dan Coats, who's currently the director of National Intelligence, the DNI, with a guy named Fred Fleitz. So Fred Fleitz was briefly the National Security Council chief of staff. He is permanently a conspiracy theory obsessed lunatic. For years, he worked with a total clown named Frank Gaffney at the Center for Security Policy. Gaffney and Fleitz in their organization think that Islamists have infiltrated the U.S. government in a plot to take over the country. That is not a joke. They try to push the idea that there are these Sharia law no-go zones in Europe, that most Muslims support violence against Americans. It's like vile, bigoted, Islamophobic stuff. It's their favorite thing to churn out. It's hard to imagine a worse person to put at the DNI to run our intelligence agencies than a bigoted conspiracy theorist. They're supposed to oversee the intelligence community. They're supposed to call balls and strikes, give the president hard truths. Hopefully this doesn't come to pass, but it was one of those reports that I read that was floated for some personnel change that actually stopped me dead in my tracks when I really thought about how much of a disaster it would be.
If this actually happens, this would be one of the craziest appointments in American history. Let's be very clear. This is like if you went to Thanksgiving dinner and your uncle at the end of the table who would show up and talk about how the moon landing was faked, was suddenly put in charge of all of the U.S. intelligence community. First of all, these people are... everybody should Google, the Frank Gaffney and Fred Fleitz,
scary people,
and this place that this kind of conspiracy theory factory that they work at, because yes, on the one hand, it's cruel stuff, and it's even worse than we're saying. I mean, like the stuff about Muslims, the stuff about how Obama had a secret agenda to try to impose Sharia law in the United States. There's an Islamist plot behind everything, or an Iranian plot, or something else. It's mean-spirited, but it's also just kind of stupid.
Yeah, very stupid.
It's so dumb. It makes, Mike Flynn look like an intellectual by comparison, right? This is the lunatic fringe of the lunatic fringe, right?
Right.
And if you put this guy in charge of the intelligence community, what kind of message does that send about what the U.S. intelligence community is and the credibility of our intelligence around the world, right? You depend upon the rest of the world to trust our word. We talked about this when we say that there were tankers that the Iranians allegedly set on fire in the Straits of Hormuz. If Fred Fleitz is the guy making that case, well, that guy said Iran is responsible for everything for the last
not
decade.
buying it.
Nobody's going to buy it. Nobody's going to listen to that guy, right? Yeah. And part of what we see is that he just kind of lavishes praise on Trump. He's got kind of like a Seb Gorka deification of Trump approach to things. If that's the standard, the rest of the world will tune us out. And how do you like to work in the intelligence community for that guy?
Did you see Seb Gorka try to pick a fight with some reporter in the Rose Garden at that bizarre social media summit?
That was the craziest thing.
Could you imagine trying to fist fight somebody in the Rose Garden of the White House?
I mean, even in year 8, I felt like...
Imagine beating up Mark Landler.
I felt lucky to even walk into the Rose Garden, even the 8th year.
I know.
The idea that I'd walk over with a faux British accent, he didn't have his Nazi pin on at the time.
Right.
I mean, he's yelling at him you punk, you punk. And then there's a bunch of fascist white supremacists chanting Gorka, Gorka.
There's a lady with a QAnon earrings shouting down the reporter.
This is the Rose Garden of the White House of the United States of America. What is happening here? The weirdest thing that happened when we were there was the turkey pardon every year, right? When Obama had to sit out there and pardon some turkey and make dumb jokes while Sasha Malia looked the other direction.
You know what was honestly the worst thing that happened in the Rose Garden was when that goober from the Daily Caller shouted at Obama. This reporter who worked for Tucker Carlson at the Daily Caller shouted at Obama at a press event.
Yeah, and the funny thing about that is I don't even think we rescinded that guy's credentials. That's how much we were open to a free press, right? Meanwhile, these guys are having WWE mosh pits with white supremacists. And by the way, the best thing is he was trying to attack some guy for words for Playboy.
Yeah.
The whole thing about it, everything about it. I mean, every now and then there's a moment that's not that big a moment, but it perfectly captures like just the depravity of the Trump years and what we're living through.
The amount of you're gonna have to clean that place when that crop is gone is gonna be.
I'm gonna have to fumigate the place. Yeah. And Gorka's put on some pounds, man. Like it looked like he could barely get in that like triple-breasted suit he was wearing.
Gorka has parlayed 6 months of sitting in some EEOB office with no actual job and no security clearance, doing nothing, into a hell of a career. That's all I can say for him. Because he's a joke.
Any man who will go on Fox News and scream in some faux accent about Islam and Democrats, like, it can get the red carpet rolled out from the White House and get all kinds of grifting opportunities out there. Like, it's not good.
Highly recommend everyone at home Googles Seb Gorka in his weird leather vest, because that's one of my favorite photos. Okay, when we come back, my interview with U.S. Senator... Sorry, I might have forgotten one thing. Okay, sorry, I did not. When we come back, my interview with U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth.